The largest welfare fraud operation in modern U.S. history did not just steal billions in taxpayer dollars. Federal investigators now believe portions of that money were secretly funneled overseas to regions controlled by extremist groups. A theft disguised as a social program suddenly morphed into a national security crisis. How could such a dangerous pipeline operate for years right under the government's nose? We uncover the full story. Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. All right, let's get right into this. To really understand what happened, we need to set the scene in Minnesota. This isn't just a story about, some stolen funds.
Not at all.
This is a system collapse. So profound that the president himself called it one of those dangerous failures in state oversight in decades.
And that's not an exaggeration.
Federal agencies are calling it an industrial-scale organized theft operation. They estimate this thing grew into a billion-dollar fraud network. And it grew so fast that it apparently just stunned seasoned investigators when they finally started pulling at the threads. So when we hear that phrase, industrial scale, what does that actually look like on the ground? What are we talking about here?
Well, that phrase, industrial scale, is so important because it moves this way beyond just a few bad actors. This was a dedicated, sophisticated enterprise.
Right.
You should think of it less like a standard criminal ring and more like a shadow corporation. One that had its own R&D department, focused completely on how to game the system and optimize payments from the government.
An R&D department for fraud.
Essentially, yes. The source material shows exactly how they did it. They built these parallel, fictitious realities just to keep extracting money day after day with almost no risk of getting caught right away.
So what were those specific mechanisms? Because to understand $1 billion, you have to understand how they manufactured that reality.
There were three main pillars to this operation, all running at the same time. The first one, and maybe the most audacious, was the creation of fake daycare centers.
Fake daycares.
And I don't just mean poorly run centers. In a lot of cases, these were just shell companies. They existed only on paper.
Wow.
They were billing the government for thousands of children who quite simply never existed. These were ghost children generating very real cash flow every single month from taxpayer funds.
And they had paperwork to back it up. Falsified attendance records and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. Complex and completely falsified records. They looked legitimate on paper, they filed for incorporation, they got state licenses, open bank accounts, but the actual service, the child care, it was completely absent.
So how does the state not catch that? How did they bypass basic verification for so long?
It really came down to exploiting the state's decentralized and often paper-based reporting systems. The state was checking paperwork. They were looking at invoices, signatures, enrollment forms.
But not physically checking the locations.
Yeah. Not with any real rigor. No unannounced physical audits, no deep cross-database verification. And these fraudsters, they were masters of documentation fraud. They faked thousands of attendance sheets, they falsified staff identities, their credentials, everything.
And they just got lost in the sheer volume of claims being processed.
Exactly. When you're processing millions of dollars in claims across hundreds of facilities, the system just defaults to trust unless there's a huge, glaring error in the math. This network was smart enough to make their numbers look plausible, even if the scale was, completely off the charts.
Which brings us to the second mechanism you mentioned, the sham meal programs. That sounds like it runs on a similar principle.
Precisely. It's the same model, different program. These were often disguised as nonprofits or community groups getting federal grants to feed vulnerable people, kids, the elderly.
Okay.
They'd file these staggering claims saying they were serving thousands of meals a day, 7 days a week. The investigation found they were serving absolutely no one.
So they were just pocketing the money for ingredients, catering, staff, all of it.
All of it. They were basically creating fake nonprofits to launder government aid that was meant to fight food insecurity.
It's more than just theft. You're right. It's resource cannibalism. They're creating a false impression that a need is being met, which stops real organizations from getting that money.
And that's where the sophistication really comes in. The third piece of this was exploiting the broader benefits system. We're talking SNOP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and various medical benefits.
How are they getting into those?
Through manipulated visa pipelines and large-scale identity fraud.
Yeah.
They manufactured identities. See, to get these benefits, you need some kind of legal presence or at least an identity in the state system. By faking those identities, they could enroll thousands of non-existent or ineligible people into programs meant for struggling American families.
So you had this perfect storm: fake service providers, fake services, and fake beneficiaries. But a billion-dollar business operating for years, that doesn't happen by accident. How could this operate for so long right under the noses of state leaders?
The analysis points to one of two things: either profound incompetence or, frankly, willful avoidance. The system was throwing up red flags, huge, unusual spikes in claims, especially during the pandemic, but the state, which is responsible for these federal funds, just failed to act.
The source material used some strong language, didn't it? Asleep at the wheel, or avoiding action due to fear of political backlash.
Yeah, exactly.
Fear of political backlash for investigating fraud. That just sounds like institutional paralysis.
It is. The concern, according to the analysis, was that if they investigated a huge fraud ring centered in a specific ethnic community, they'd be accused of profiling or political harassment.
And that hesitation gave the criminals the space they needed to grow.
It gave them the operational space to expand exponentially. I mean, this wasn't a loophole. It wasn't a clerical error. It was defined as organized, deliberate, and industrial-scale theft. The fact that it got this big points to a multi-year failure by the state to police its own systems, and that negligence is what turned this into a national security threat.
Institutional paralysis paving the way for industrial-scale crime. That's the contrast that finally forced the federal government to step in.
That's exactly right. When local accountability breaks down on this scale, it creates a vacuum. And in this case, that vacuum was filled by something much more dangerous than just domestic criminals.
And that vacuum you just mentioned, that leads us right into the moment this story went from being a massive local crime to a full-blown national security crisis. President Trump, as the report says, detonated this scandal onto the national stage. He completely shifted the focus by fusing immigration, fraud, and extremism into one mission. His frustration was reportedly aimed right at that political failure. He said, "Enough of watching corruption networks drain billions of dollars from the American taxpayer."
A very clear statement of intent.
He made it clear the days of pretending this was just, an acceptable cost of doing business were over.
And that shift was immediate. It was profound. Normally, a welfare fraud case, even a big one, would be handled by the Department of Justice, maybe Treasury, the FBI, financial crimes.
Standard procedure.
Right. But the president mobilized ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That signaled a total reclassification of the threat. The whole investigation moved from a criminal prosecution file to a terrorism finance microscope.
Okay, walk us through what that means. A terrorism finance microscope. What specific intelligence were they tracking that made them escalate it so urgently?
They weren't just looking at local cash movements anymore. They were tracking large, suspicious financial flows across borders, specifically remittances. Early reports suggested that portions of these funds may have been funneled overseas into regions that are controlled by extremist groups.
So they were connecting the stolen welfare money to global money transfers.
Yes, specifically through what are called money transfer operators, or MTOs.
Explain that for our listeners. What are MTOs and why are they a vulnerability?
So MTOs, especially informal remittance networks, are often used by diaspora communities to send money home. They can operate outside the big traditional banking channels that have really strict anti-money laundering regulations.
Okay, so they're harder to track.
Much harder. And investigators saw a pattern. Large, clustered, structured transfers coming from the same addresses and identities already flagged in the Minnesota fraud case. The structuring was key. They were keeping the amounts just below the legal reporting thresholds to avoid automatic detection.
So the taxpayer money was being stolen, laundered, and then sent overseas through channels that offer speed and anonymity.
Which are the exact two things you need if you're funding extremist operations. And this is the so what factor that changed everything. The reports didn't just point to one region. They talked about transfers lining up with multiple extremist control regions.
So American tax dollars, which were supposed to be feeding needy kids in Minnesota, were potentially being weaponized against U.S. interests abroad.
That's the nightmare scenario. It transforms the whole narrative from simple corruption to a direct threat. If even a fraction of those billions supported hostile groups, the vulnerability is just monumental.
It's no longer just theft. It's an established financial pipeline that, as the report says, could compromise American safety.
And that's precisely why the president mobilized ICE and used that decisive language. It highlights this critical connection that's often overlooked. Soft security gaps, like weak welfare oversight, can very quickly become hard security liabilities.
A local bureaucratic failure, creating a financial support system for our enemies overseas. That's what triggered the federal response.
The sheer volume of cash made it an incredibly attractive funding source. It was stable, it was predictable. For an extremist group, a steady, laundered stream of billions is, well, it's invaluable for logistics, for recruiting, for everything. Seeing that money flow to those specific flagged regions on the intelligence map, that was the trigger.
And that urgency led directly to the major ICE surge into Minnesota. This wasn't a small operation. It was described as a full-scale, boots-on-the-ground operation.
A very decisive federal escalation.
But the key here seems to be the precision. This is not a random sweep, was it?
No, not at all. The word that was used over and over was surgical. This was months in the making. It only launched after financial intelligence, visa data, and local surveillance were all cross-referenced to build these exhaustive target lists.
So they knew who they were looking for before they even went in.
They knew exactly where to look. They were targeting specific addresses, businesses, and individuals that had been flagged multiple times for the financial transfers, the sham childcare operations, and critically for fraudulent immigration applications.
So it's that data synergy that gave them the edge.
Yeah.
How did they link all that information together when it's usually stuck in different government silos?
That's where the federal advantage comes in. They could link an address that was getting welfare payments for, say, 50 ghost children to a bank account sending out high-volume remittances.
Okay.
Then they'd cross-reference those names and addresses with the USCIS database, that's Citizenship and Immigration Services, looking for patterns in visa applications. And they found them. Overlapping identities, the same people acting as guarantors, a whole recurring network.
And the visa application process itself seems to be the linchpin here. It's what gave the network access to the benefit system in the first place.
It was the fuel for the fire. To get into these programs, you need some form of legal presence, or at least a fake identity that looks real enough. The visa fraud wasn't just an accessory crime, it was the engine that enabled the massive identity fraud.
And that connection led to that astonishing statement from Governor Kristi Noem.
Yes. She claimed that 50% of all Minnesota visa applications showed signs of fraud.
50%?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not just a few people slipping through the cracks, that's a systemic collapse of the entire process.
It's a failure of integrity, absolutely. And the types of fraud were highly structured, which suggests people were being coached by the same criminal organizers.
What kind of fraud are we talking about?
Well, rampant use of sham marriages, for one, people entering fraudulent relationships just to get the legal status, which then let them access SNAP and housing aid.
And the manufactured identities you mentioned.
Right. Not just stolen identities, but completely fabricated paper trails. They were creating eligible beneficiaries out of thin air. They also found applicants claiming to be related to people already in the U.S. who weren't even in the same hemisphere. The audacity was just off the charts.
So every one of those fraudulent visas was basically a key that unlocked taxpayer-funded programs.
Precisely. Every fraudulent visa provided another access point into government programs. Programs, and we have to keep saying this, meant for struggling American families, not for funding criminal enterprises.
And that's the direct, chilling connection.
Yeah.
The weak visa system enabled the industrial welfare fraud, which in turn fueled the national security risk.
A multi-pronged pipeline, and the federal action was designed to disrupt all of it at once.
But the moment those federal agents moved in, the dynamic shifted. It went from a law enforcement action to a political confrontation.
Immediately, and that's when the political firestorm really ignited.
The political establishment in Minneapolis reacted, and they reacted decisively. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who represents the district right at the epicenter of this, she found herself in the middle of it.
Her response was scrutinized very heavily.
The analysis points to her posture, which was described as quick and dismissive. She shrugged off this massive scandal as just political noise.
Right. She famously said she wasn't worried about deportation, which was seen by many as an attempt to reframe a targeted criminal investigation into a broad political attack on the whole community.
And the issue wasn't really her personal fate, but what the analysis called her refusal to acknowledge the magnitude of the crisis. Billions stolen, national security on the line.
And that dismissiveness just poured more fuel on the fire, especially with the federal government, who saw this as a critical intervention.
This also played into the broader conflict over the rhetoric President Trump was using.
That context is vital. His language was very charged, no question. But in his follow-up statements, he was very clear about the target. He said he was pursuing individuals tied to the fraud who live in America, take American benefits, and then turn around and call this country the worst place on earth.
So he was drawing a distinction.
He explicitly stated he was not targeting hardworking Somali Americans, but going after those tied to criminal abuse and what he called anti-American rhetoric. It was that contradiction he was focused on, taking billions from the system while being hostile to it.
But the local leadership in Minneapolis pushed back hard with a completely different narrative.
Oh, yes. The mayor, police leadership, they mobilized almost instantly with what were described as rehearsed talking points. They insisted the feds were villainizing the entire Somali community.
Highlighting that they were a treasured part of the city's fabric.
Exactly, stressing the cultural contributions, the successful families and businesses, which of course are all valid points.
But where did the analysis say their argument broke down?
The critical point of friction was their refusal to separate the community from the criminals that are hiding within it. The feds were saying, this is a surgical strike on a criminal ring. The local leaders were saying, this is an attack on our community.
And by not drawing that line.
By not drawing that line, the analysis suggests they poured accelerant on the tensions. They turned a necessary law enforcement operation into this broad, polarizing political conflict.
And that political heat then escalated into a genuine and very controversial constitutional conflict with the Minneapolis police chief.
This was the shocking part. Legally, this was huge. After the ICE surge, the police chief gave public advice. He told residents if they saw federal agents performing lawful enforcement, they should call 911.
Wait, call 911 on federal law enforcement.
And he went even further. He suggested that local officers might intervene if residents felt their rights were being violated by the federal operation.
So he was basically telling his officers to obstruct a federal investigation, an investigation into fraud and national security threats.
That is the profound implication. The analysis sees this as a growing rebellion inside these sanctuary cities. It suggests local officials were willing to use their police power to potentially block federal investigations to protect a political narrative.
Which raises huge constitutional questions. The supremacy clause, right?
Right.
Federal law trumps state law.
That's the core of it. What happens when local police try to physically obstruct investigations and federal agents collide? This isn't just political rhetoric anymore. It's a physical and legal barricade being built against a federal response.
We have to bring this back to the money, because that financial trail is where the national security risk really becomes clear. What did the investigators find when they dug into that remittance data?
This was the pivot point. They looked at billions of dollars flowing out of the U.S. from Minnesota every year. They used forensic accounting to look for those structured payments, amounts just under the reporting thresholds.
The classic sign of money laundering.
Exactly. And they focused on the addresses and the fraudulent entities that were sending the money. What they found was alarming.
What was it?
They found a suspicious clustering of billions of dollars sent overseas, a high volume of transactions coming from a very narrow geographic area, all tied to the fraud network. And that cluster lined up disturbingly close to areas flagged by federal intelligence agencies.
High-risk zones, areas controlled by extremist groups.
The very same ones. And this points to a critical failure of the anti-money laundering reporting structure at the state and local levels. The consequence is just massive. American tax dollars flowing directly into regions hostile to the United States.
So it's not just financial crime. It's inadvertently funding national defense threats with our own social safety net.
It completely changes the conversation about the cost of this abuse. The scale and the destination of the funds confirm that the state's failure of oversight created a strategic vulnerability for the entire nation.
So let's pivot and make this real for everyone listening, no matter where they live. Beyond the national security angle, how does this billion-dollar theft actually hit every American household?
Well, President Trump framed this as an affordability crisis, and it's a powerful argument. He argued that this kind of systemic fraud is like a hidden tax on every single American. When the system is drained like this, the costs get pushed onto you, the average consumer.
He connected it directly to things like grocery prices, rent, and overwhelmed hospitals.
Yes, he argued they aren't separate issues. They're interconnected consequences of this massive resource drain.
Okay, so let's break that down. Start with groceries. How does fraudulent SNAP enrollment actually make my food more expensive at the checkout line?
It's a concept economists call demand distortion. When millions of dollars in illegal benefits flood the market, it artificially inflates demand. Grocery stores have to deal with higher inventory costs, higher demand pressures, all of it.
So they pass that cost on.
They pass those systemic strains onto the consumer. It's like a hidden fraud tax that gets baked into the price of everything. When billions are siphoned off by people who were never entitled to them, you, the listener who paid taxes for these programs, you pay the price again through inflation.
And the same logic applies to the housing market and rent.
Absolutely. The massive infusion of illegal benefits drives up competition for housing, especially at the lower end. This artificially inflates rent for everyone, including citizens who are paying their way honestly. The criminals are essentially using taxpayer money to outbid them for a place to live.
It's a direct assault on their economic security.
It is. And finally, you have the impact on healthcare. Overloaded hospitals, longer waits, higher premiums.
Explain that resource drain.
A system like healthcare is based on shared risk and funded resources. When tens of thousands of ineligible people access it fraudulently, the whole thing strains.
Right.
Longer wait times for legitimate citizens who've paid in their whole lives. And the immense uncompensated costs from fraudulent claims or overuse of emergency rooms, that has to be absorbed somewhere.
And it's absorbed through higher insurance premiums and higher taxes.
Exactly. The pool of resources meant for legitimate users gets critically diluted, and it leads to higher costs for every single person.
So the Minnesota scandal isn't just some distant story. It's a warning that a failure of oversight thousands of miles away can directly raise your grocery bill, your rent, and your healthcare costs.
That was the president's argument, that restoring fairness starts with restoring vigilance. If you let criminal enterprises run wild, every single honest American pays the price.
We've covered the fraud, the national security threat, the economic cost. The final question has to be about accountability. Fraud on this scale doesn't happen in a vacuum. So, should the state leaders who oversaw Minnesota during this multi-year collapse, should they face consequences, an investigation, removal from office?
That really is the ultimate test of governance, isn't it? The reports emphasized that this only became a national security threat because high-level officials ignored massive warning signs year after year.
So the focus shifts from just prosecuting the criminals
to demanding accountability from the officials who failed to run the programs responsibly. The institutional breakdown is what allowed this to flourish. That points to a profound problem at the highest levels of state leadership.
And this isn't necessarily about criminal charges for them, but consequences for what seems to be profound administrative and political incompetence.
Precisely. At a minimum, they need to provide transparency. They have to answer for the lack of audits, for the political reluctance to investigate, for an environment that let fake companies operate freely for years. The debate is about what level of negligence demands accountability when $1 billion are lost.
The White House has clearly signaled that this is paramount moving forward.
Yes. President Trump promised a zero-tolerance approach to this kind of oversight failure. He talked about putting people in leadership who love this country and protect its resources.
So we can expect a big shift in how federal agencies oversee state programs.
I think we can expect a significant restructuring, especially around how agencies like Treasury and IC coordinate with state welfare boards. The focus isn't just on the ground-level criminals anymore, but on the political and administrative cowardice that enabled the whole crisis.
This deep dive really forces us to confront a difficult reality, doesn't it? The fragility of our systems and the shocking proximity between domestic welfare abuse and international security threats. It's a terrifying lesson.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for staying with us for this crucial deep dive into the evidence and the profound implications of this systemic failure.
That's all for this deep dive, but it leaves us with one haunting question. If the guardians of the rules are the first to break them, who is left to protect the game?